Okay, so I realized possibly some of you out there may not have access to sound or speakers or headphones or anything like that. So, this is just too important. So just in case for all you guys out there who aren't able to listen to this interview, I'm going to play it for you right here. So here we go. It's about 7.5 minutes long. Just be patient, but it has some very, very important, pertinent information that we all need to hear. So here we go.
First, I'd like to put into context the events of the last few days with regard to negotiations both in Munich and in Brussels. There was an agreement in Munich under the Syria Support Group to reach some form of a ceasefire. Now, what public opinion is not aware of is that on the same day as this agreement was reached, there was a meeting behind closed doors in Brussels. It was at NATO headquarters. It was not called by NATO, it was called by the Pentagon. It was an initiative of the Pentagon with Defense Secretary Carter present and chairing the meeting, and also present at that meeting were the main protagonists in the forthcoming planned invasion of Syria, namely Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And the Crown Prince, Defense Minister of Saudi Arabia, was present and had meetings behind closed doors with Defense Secretary Carter. And this pertains to the plan, the ground invasion of Syria by Saudi forces as well as by Turkish forces. But of course, Turkish forces are already there. So what is really new in these developments is the fact that Saudi Arabia, on the request of the United States, would be involved in ground operations, always under the pretext of going after the ISIL or Daesh terrorists, which happen to be supported, recruited, and funded by Saudi Arabia. So in an absurd situation with regard to who are the enemies, who are the friends, and so on and so forth, but that is the nature of this absurd fake diplomacy. But I think what is important to underline there is that both Saudi Arabia and Turkey are maybe involved in a process of boots on the ground. Turkey is already there, but it would be coordinated between these two countries. Riyadh and Ankara are collaborating specifically in that regard, but it was very clear in the statements made by Saudi Arabia that they would only intervene at the request of the United States. In other words, Saudi Arabia is not acting on its own behalf, it's acting on behalf of the United States. And in effect, this really means that U.S. supported forces would be inside Syria. This process goes ahead. And the situation of Turkey is somewhat different because Turkey is not a 100% proxy of the United States. It has its own agenda. Of course, it has borders with Syria. It wants to annex part of Syrian territory. But nonetheless, I can say, knowing how decisions are taken from the military standpoint, everything is coordinated at the level of NATO, the Pentagon, and the various partners. So that in effect, what we are dealing with is not an invasion by Turkey and Saudi Arabia. It is an invasion which is sponsored by the United States, coordinated by the Pentagon and NATO. So that is the context. And of course, if this proceeds, any kind of confrontation between, let's say, Saudi or Turkish forces and Syria's main allies, Iran and Russia, could lead into a process of escalation. And this was, of course, underscored by the Russian Prime Minister at the Munich Security Conference. So that is the context, and it's extremely dangerous crossroads, which could potentially lead to a much broader war, whereby, because up to now, it has been a war against terrorists, and it's a war of the terrorists supported by the Western military alliance against Syria. And of course, everybody knows that these terrorists are supported. They're the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance. But now that they've been defeated, largely with the support of the Russian bombing campaign, we're moving into a new scenario which could lead to, in fact, which is more of a theater type of war with conventional forces from Turkey, Syria, special forces from from the Western military alliance, including U.S., mercenaries, intelligence ops, etc., on the ground, and that could lead to confrontation between, let's say, Turkey and Russia, possibly, which then would imply also the possible involvement of NATO, given the fact that there's a collective security agreement between NATO states. So that is the situation we are in at the moment.
And looking back to the words of the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, you mentioned there at the Munich conference, but of course later on he spoke during an interview with Euro News, and he did say that he thought that putting boots on the ground by the Saudis and Turkey, this could and would lead to a full-fledged war.
Well, we're already in a full-fledged war. It's just that the nature of this war is now changing from a proxy war to an outright theater war. And yes, indeed. And knowing how the Pentagon analyzes scenarios, these scenarios are already there. They're on the drawing board of the Pentagon. There are plans to wage World War III, but that's nothing new. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but the scenarios of World War III have been simulated on and off, since the end of the Cold War, during the Cold War, and since the end of the Cold War. And then we see the militarization in Eastern Europe. We see the conduct of some of the largest war games on Russia's doorstep. And in other words, it's not strictly the analysis of what's happening in one particular location in the Middle East, namely Syria and Iraq. It's the broader picture. It's the fact that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, primarily, those countries are also a threat in various ways, and there's an international geopolitical process which is unfolding. There are civil wars which are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, largely as a result of the presence of Al-Qaeda-affiliated organizations like Boko Haram, all of which are supported by U.S. intelligence. We know that. So we are in a war, yet at the same time, that global war is more of a non-conventional type. It's not strictly based on theater operations. If we look elsewhere in the world, we see that the United States is intent upon regime change in Venezuela, in Argentina, in Ecuador. So all those occurrences up to a certain point are interrelated. And I think what, of course, the concern of Russia's prime minister is linked very much to the dangers and the risks of confrontation between NATO forces in Syria, if they are boots on the ground, particularly by Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia is an ally of NATO, and Russian forces, Russian or Iranian forces, which are there. And in effect, these acts of provocation are also, invariably, they are planned in advance. That the United States may be seeking precisely to generate a war pretext incident, something which will then provide them with the pretext and the justification to enter into a broader war. Escalation is a hypothesis of military planning. So we are at a dangerous crossroads, and when the Russian Prime Minister says we're back in the Cold War, I think it's an understatement, because the situation today is far more serious.
Okay, so there's the interview. As you can see, some very, very interesting and allegations and comments by this guy, Michel Chossudovsky. And I just, instead of just having you guys listen to that, I went through some of the links I've been sending my friends and family over the past few days. If you guys maybe haven't, been catching up on the news, I just wanted to inject some of those articles so you could see all the build-up around the world, as well as the fact that the economies and the markets of the world are in full meltdown mode, showing that this is just history repeating itself. They're starting World War III to cover up the economic collapse. And just be on the lookout for false flags and all that stuff. So the fact that North Korea is over there, they're the wild card in my opinion as well. They've got their satellite, and they're going to be launching more satellites passing over us. God knows how many times a day, and